We're getting back to the weathering desk this week, but first we have to take a trip through the kitchen. Salt chipping coming up on JC's Riptrack. Hi there, my name is John and welcome to JC's Riptrack. If this is your first time here and you're looking for tips and advice on how to transform your plastic models into something that you would see on the rails today, then please hit subscribe and that little bell icon so you can be notified anytime I upload a new video. So here's a question. Have you ever used an unusual technique in order to get a realistic weathering effect? What has worked? What hasn't? Let me know in the comment section down below. Now before we get started, we have to take a trip into the kitchen. So here we are in our kitchen because I needed to raid the pantry in order to get the materials that I need for this technique. Salt chipping is one of several subtractive techniques when it comes to painting and weathering. While this is my own label for it, the idea is that paint is removed from the model in order to achieve a certain effect. In this case, it's creating a realistic chipping effect by using salt and other powders to create a mask on the model. Now, salt chipping is a technique that is best used on an undecorated or fully repainted model. Now, this method can be used with other forms of weathering as well, but for the moment, we're going to stick to how it can be used to create some very realistic looking worn paint. So in front of the pantry, I wanted to talk about some of the different materials and salts that we can use. So let's have a look. Oddly enough, the one type of salt that you actually don't want to use is basic table salt. The reason is, the grains in this are too square. If you pour them out and take a look at them, they're shaped like tiny little cubes and they're all roughly the same size. This isn't going to give you a realistic looking chipped effect at all. Now you could mix a little bit in, but for the most part, this by itself, don't use. What you really want to use is a coarser type of salt. And so what I'm going to suggest here, even though chemically it's the same, the way it's processed is a little bit different. In this case, you're looking for a coarse salt, either a sea salt or a kosher salt or something that you can use in a grinder. Now, of course, you're also going to need a grinder for this as well, but this gives uneven sizes. Now the sea salt has some other compounds in it, and which is why it has a less uniform look to it. So take some of the coarse salt in a grinder, and then grind out some onto a piece of paper. I've put this on a black surface so that you can actually see it, but any paper will do. You won't need a lot of it, about half of a dessert spoon at most. But we're not quite done here. The real secret for using the salt chipping technique is to use more than one kind of salt. So we're going to use something with a much finer grain. Sodium bicarbonate, or as most of us know it as, baking soda. Most of you probably have this in your fridge and freezer, especially if you're trying to use it to deodorize something. This stuff is quite fine, but there's no need to grind it. So just take a small spoon and sprinkle it in the salt that you've already ground. Mix the two together a little bit and then use the paper as a funnel to put it into a small medicine cup. And now it's time to get down to the hobby desk, but we need to do a little bit of preparation first. With any subtractive method of weathering, we have to put down the layers of paint that will be exposed. I want this boxcar to be an old, rusted mess, so the first layers of paint need to simulate it, even if a lot of this layer ends up getting covered up. After priming and pre-shading the model, which you got a glimpse of in the previous videos, I gave the boxcar a full coat of Tamiya XF9 Hull Red. Following this, I applied various rust tones with Games Workshop's Mournfang Brown and Scrag Brown using a sponge. At this point, I wanted to say that I should have used a clear coat between this step and the next step. I didn't, but in retrospect, this is something that I would advise if you're doing any sort of subtractive method that you're going to be removing paint. You do need to protect the layers well first. So I would advise that a satin lacquer varnish would be your best bet at this stage. You see, I had a few problems a little later on that would have been prevented had I used a satin clear coat. Up until this point, I've not really made use of weathering pigments, but now it's time to break them out. These pigments serve a dual purpose. The most obvious is to help provide some rust tones, but the real magic is that pigments are a fine powder and will help with the chipping effect. I prefer in this case to apply the pigments wet. The pigments I am using here are from Forgeworld. dark rust, light rust, and orange rust. I put a small amount of each into the center of my oil palette, and then mix them with a bit of odorless thinner. Using a brush, I then apply them in various places to the surface of the model and different color consistencies. I then let it all dry. The odorless thinner holds the pigments in place, but it's a light bond when it dries, and they can still be brushed off. That's actually a plus for what I'm trying to do here. After this dried, I applied a bit of masking tape to the roof because I was going to be doing that a bit later. Now it's time to break out the salt that we collected in the kitchen. Once the pigment step has fully dried, take a brush, dip it in clean water, and spread it across the model. Once the surface is soaked, I then take the blended salt mixture in the medicine cup and then use a few different ways to sprinkle it into the water of the surface of the model. The application is semi-random, but I try to sprinkle it in around the doors and other places that the paint may wear out a little bit more. Once this is done, it's time to let the model dry. The water holds the salt in place, but it also slightly dissolves it and makes it adhere to the surface of the model a little bit better. Once the salt mixture had had time to dry, it was time to come in with the paint. This time around, I decided to try AK Interactive's new Real Color line again, this time with the color Pale Blue. After a bit of experimenting, I've since discovered that these paints do thin nicely with alcohol-based thinners like X20A or 91% denatured alcohol. They're now definitely part of my library, and I quite like them a lot. Using my airbrush, I build up the colors in the model, painting directly over the dried salt and the model as a whole. I usually try to spray a light coat first, and then come back adding thin layers until it is completely coated. After letting the paint dry for a bit, it was time to remove the salt. Initially, I took a dry paintbrush and used it to rub off the loose grains of salt and baking soda using mostly downward strokes. This is where the chips become visible. As the salt comes away from the model, it takes the paint with it, and it leaves the layer underneath exposed. Some of the salt is a little more stubborn, and I had to wet the surface of the model to dissolve more of the salt and rub that away. In this process, some of the weathering pigments on the underlayer are also removed, but they also discolor some of the surface paint along with some very subtle streaks. In essence, the weathering pigments are also a type of salt that gets partially removed. I then let the model dry and came back to see what else I might want to do with it. For the second round, there were a few places where there had been too much salt and more paint was removed than I wanted to. So I did the same process, but this time targeting a few spots rather than a general application and keeping it a bit lighter. When I used the airbrush, I didn't paint over the whole model, but rather kept it tight and focused in on the areas where I had applied a new layer of salt, feathering the edges to blend it into the whole model. The roof was handled exactly the same way, but I masked off the rest of the model and applied the salt. In retrospect, I probably should have done the roof first, as those tiny little flakes in the metallic paint get everywhere. They're kind of like glitter. I'll need to do some touch-ups when I do more weathering to the model. Once the salt process with the roof was completed, I then came back with a pair of acrylic washes to tone it down and enhance the worn look. These acrylic washes are from Games Workshop. I started with Nuln Oil, and then after it had dried, some Reichland Flesh Shade to enhance the general rust tone. This will be further enhanced a little bit later in the weathering process, but now I have a good base to work on as I move on to the next stages of weathering this model. As a bonus tip, chipping is just one way that a salt mask can be used for weathering models. For example, aircraft modelers use this quite frequently to create a nice mottled weathering and faded effect on their aircraft. And this could even be used as a type of fading to create an uneven sort of fade on factory painted models. Now, I've just shown one method of this, but there are a number of different ways to do this. Also, there's several more subtractive techniques that I'm going to be getting into in later videos, and you're not going to want to miss those. So there's how the salt chipping technique works, but the model, as you may have noticed, isn't quite finished yet. I imagine you're probably thinking, hey, that looks pretty good, but there's still something missing. And you'd be right. No one technique can get the perfect look right away, this salt chipping technique included. Salt chipping also creates an interesting problem, especially when it comes to applying decals. After all, fresh, clean decals will look really weird on a very heavily chipped surface. But I did think of that. In fact, this car provides an excellent canvas on which we can actually get into how to effectively weather decals after you've applied them. But you're going to have to wait till the next video to find out how we do that. So teaser aside, I hope you found this helpful, and if you're looking for tips and advice on how to get the most out of your painting and weathering projects, then please hit subscribe and that little bell icon so you can be notified anytime I upload a new video. And also check the links below for any of the products that I've used in this video. Also, you can find links down there for my Facebook and Twitter accounts for daily weathering tips, as well as my Instagram account that gives teasers on upcoming videos. So thanks for watching, good luck, and may you keep on track.